My job is to help bring what I consider really a top-notch panel of experts, practitioners, and really leaders in the education reform world with some specificity on charter schools to you to help us understand, know, learn, and hopefully grow what I think we all consider a really important movement. And I'm just going to start out, give you a few thoughts myself, a little historic overview before we turn it over, and really would love to engage you all in this conversation. And so there is a microphone. If in the middle of any of us talking, you want to offer some thoughts or have a question, I think all of us would invite some interactive dialogue today in this session. So first, I just want to kind of recap some of what we've heard. And I'm assuming most of you have been to probably, has everyone been to the breakfast? Everyone hear Tony Williams? Pretty much. A lot of people, oh, these folks were sleeping, obviously. They didn't raise their hand. And the dinner last night, were we all at dinner? Great, because I'm going to refer to some of that, and if we need to do crib notes later, just ask. But I think Tony Williams took us to a brand new place. He basically said, we need to get moving or get out. So you're going to hear a lot of stuff here in the other sessions about practical stuff and how to get there, and we're going to think about whether it takes 2 months, 2 years, 3 decades, whatever, but I want to just stay with sort of the get moving and get out, because I think that's a great overview for where charter schools are actually helping lead us. And Secretary Spelling said something that I actually thought was incredibly provocative last night. She said the term 24/7 means nothing for us in public education. And that is really true, and I think that's why we're talking about reform. And then there was this dialogue, some of you might remember, between Governor Bush and Governor Romer about the Nixon at China when it came to the unions and other things. I know our friends from the FEA are here, and I'm delighted they're here to engage in this conversation, because I actually think the Nixon at China thing, you know, some of us remember the Nixon to China illusion. 1972, Nixon spent 5 days cozying up to China, right? He wanted to go there and show that actually creating a dialogue and talking and showing some interest in China might get us someplace. And it did actually help reduce a little bit of the hostilities, but neither communism nor the actual hostilities went away with Nixon to China. I actually want to introduce a new illusion that hasn't been talked about. I want to suggest the reform's more like Reagan to Gorbachev. Okay? He changed Eastern Europe and ended the Cold War. He didn't just go and visit and say, how you doing? I want to understand your perspective. Now I'm going to go home. I'm going to try to incorporate you into what we're doing. He said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Whether you like the guy or not, whether you remember him fondly or think he was a beast, he did end the Cold War. Even the negative historians think so. And why did that happen? Because it was a challenge, it was a threat, and only did sort of the perestroika or the Nixon to China thing happen after there was the challenge and the threat. Only after that could there be a dialogue. And I'd suggest to you that charters and the choice that it kind of embraces is sort of like Star Wars. It's not just Nixon, it's Reagan to Gorbachev. Now, charters are not the answer, just in case anybody wants to walk out of here saying, oh, I think I heard people say they're the answer. They're not the answer. They're actually something more fundamental than the answer, because answers are easy. We all have answers for a lot of things. They're the model for a new structure of public education. Think about it. Money follows kids, or at least it's supposed to, does in most places. We'll talk about that. Performance pay is permitted. In about 40% of the cases we've studied, it actually does happen to some extent. The reasons it doesn't happen were probably something that Checker will help eke out for us in the research review. Performance pay, money follows kids, provides choice, has standards, accountability in exchange for flexibility. That sounds like in every single session I've been in and some of the dialogues going on, whether you are a chancellor of an urban district and are challenging the status quo within the system, or you're on the margins on a tax credit or voucher effort, whether it's big or small, or you're in a charter debate, we're talking about changing a structure for education. So I would suggest charters are sort of that model. Nixon to China, no, because it can only be the model if really systems are forced to change. We would not be in this room today historically had the idea of competition through choice and charter schools not been introduced, not been pushed from the very beginning. Williams said to us this morning, Tony Williams, Senator Williams, take your money, demand better, right? Let's walk. You want my money? Educate my kids. You want the privilege of educating my children? Here's the money, otherwise I walk. It's a fundamental shift in the way we were thinking back in 1992 when the first charter school was opened. And this wasn't planned. As much as it's absolutely wonderful that we have people actually who can do this and we can look at it historically, and a lot of us really are out there in front talking about it and writing and leading and doing magazine articles. There weren't a bunch of people sitting around analyzing this in 1991 when Governor Rudy Perpich of Minnesota, a progressive Democrat, or was he the Farm Labor Party? He might have been the Farm Labor Party, introduced this notion that had been talked about by a bunch of local academic, some of them, and practitioners and educators who actually came up with public school choice to start with. So boom, 1991, the first charter school law is made. You would think that like it had been talked about for years. Yes, it had been talked about by L. Shanker at one time. Before that, Ray Buddy, who was the great-grandfather, is considered. There's all sorts of names you can throw out in research, but the reality was it was a politician with a bunch of his inner cabinet folks and advisors who said, we've been looking at this idea. We think it needs to go. It gets in the legislature, it passes, and all of a sudden, we're on our way. It wasn't centralized planning. It was very organic. And the idea was very basic. It wasn't a lot of what you hear today. It was supposed to be a laboratory for innovation in public education. Some of you legislators will hear, show me that it's working. Show me that there's this effect that you said it was going to change public education. Actually, that's not what happened. Parents pushed, educators pushed, lawmakers to give them more control. It was about control and choice and, yes, doing things better. The idea was you give us more power to the people, let us spend our money where we want in a fairly modest way, because after all, this wasn't vouchers, right? Oh my gosh, that's just crazy. It was public charter schools. How this works, we'll talk about it. You'll hear from Donald Hense. Donald is the most successful charter school manager, leader. In fact, he's really an entrepreneur extraordinaire who runs what's considered the largest single charter school in the country, although it's broken into 5 different campuses. His children come in, as he'll tell you, way below the poverty level. He has every challenge any educator could ever witness or be part of, and yet his kids graduate and go on to colleges with scholarships in droves. And you'll hear from Jim Goenner about what it takes to actually get a charter school up and running with high levels of quality and accountability. Jim Goenner runs the Central Michigan University Center for Charter Schools, which is a model authorizer outside of the school board control that has actually given life to almost 50 or more charter schools. I'll let him clarify that. And you'll hear from Checker Finn, who is truly, I'm not going to call you grandfather Checker, I'm not going to give the elder statesman, maybe I could say like you were the first among many. I'm not going to do any of that to you, but Checker actually is a true leader, crusader, smart guy, which you'll hear talk about the research and look at this in ways, always, that nobody else can ever do it. So let me just paint the real picture before I turn that over. 41 states, right? Sounds great. 4,200 schools, about 1.4 million kids. 12% of all schools that have ever opened in the charter movement have closed. Not bad. Some people think that's really bad. We're closing charter schools. Some people think more need to be closed. In fact, there's a huge debate, which I'm sure we'll get into, and we should, about whether we should be closing more. Is it less? Is it 20%? Is it 30%? State tests in just about every state that has charter schools show us great news about charters. Some states show us overwhelming news over all but a couple. Few states, it's really hard to see. As we know, data, we are so behind in the data curve. We know so little really about how children do. Even on the better state tests, we have these debates about proficiency. We talk about value added. I would argue, and a lot of people in this room may disagree with me, and I'll take them on anytime. I would argue that the vast majority of charter schools, and I'm talking about the 90% level, are actually doing better for kids. And that's not an opinion, based on state tests, based on what we see locally. We don't go a day without looking at this information, because when you start cracking the numbers and look at who's in those charter schools and how those schools are faring, and you look at the ultimate levels of accountability, there are 4 or 5 or 6 data points for every school that you can combine for a success. And when you look at the schools that are closing and you look at the accountability of the schools that are staying open, it is a phenomenal record across the board, but we don't have one national barometer. In fact, our national assessments tell us very little. What we do know is when schools are in states that have strong authorization processes, when there are groups in place that advocate for and help monitor, not overly regulate, but help monitor schools, states like New York, Michigan, Colorado, Massachusetts, Washington, D.C., you get healthy sums of charter schools that are serving kids quality education, despite the fact that more than 60% of those children are poor or at risk compared to the traditional system, which is, on average, considerably less. So we do know that most charters that are clustered in great law states do well. We do know that there are issues like in every single industry, and we should always be willing to accept, move on, and continue to get better. And we do know that actually charter schools are an art and a science at the same time. We know it takes great laws. We actually know what to do to educate children well. And we also know that giving people the freedom, flexibility, and holding them to those firm ends, as Checkerfin likes to say, loose on the means, will help get us there. And the drive and the thing for legislators and advocates all over the country that we hear most of all is continue to give me that flexibility, that freedom. Continue to give me the ability to start those schools, continue to watch me, but don't ever pull it back because you want to watch an experiment. There are states in this country that will say, we love charter schools. We're going to try 5 or 10 this year. We're going to try 5 or 10 in the next 5. We're going to see a pilot. I take you back to Senator Williams, basically, move on or get off the ship. Because we cannot afford to discount any reform we have when it is so clearly something that is operating 4,200 that we can see, that we have a lens on. We have more research and data on the charter school movement than just about any other single reform effort. And if we had as much data and research and as many eyes and lenses on everything else, we may not be doing so many other things badly, and we may be doing more of this good. So I'm going to kick it off to Donald Hense, whose schools are a perfect blend of both art and science. Donald has proven keen structure for kids, great student outcomes, and a demand for excellence. And my good friend.
I don't often get a chance to appear on panels, so this is really nice for me. Good morning, everyone. In thinking about all of the things that we could possibly talk about today, I often want to spend some time talking just about what happens in trying to get a school together and get it off of the ground. We can talk about the law, we can talk about the policies and things of that nature, but if you were just able to take a few minutes and pare that down to what the impact of it would be on a charter operator trying to put some schools together. And that really is the framework that we began, the Friendship Schools in Washington. We were in the first wave of charter schools to open there in 1998. This is our 10th year of operation. We were a part of the ignored group in the sense that people in this whole public structure of ours were laughing and saying, oh, wow, they forced it off these schools on us. Now some of them are going to open. And so they were hooting and laughing because they thought everybody would have maybe 50 kids or 100 kids. I opened on September 5th with 1,368 children and a waiting list of more than 1,000. And so the gauntlet was more or less thrown down. We had partnered with Edison Schools. We had renovated buildings that they tried to keep us out of, and it was unbelievable. Our kids were strolling to school the first day in uniforms. And we all know what the symbol of that is. Beautiful kids, beautiful uniforms. Got to the school, and the city refused to give us occupancy permits. So we ordered buses, so we're not going to be defeated. We ordered buses for the 2 campuses, and they pulled up. 5 minutes to 8, they decided to give us occupancy permits. Nothing had changed in the building in several weeks, other than the fact that we had put furniture in. All of the systems had already been in place. We had renovated, remodeled, wiped, scrubbed, everything. And so the very nice part about that is that within an hour, if you had walked through our building, teaching was going on. There was order, there was structure. And we have tried to maintain that in the 10 years that we have been open. Friendship has now grown to where we have more than 4,000 students, but that too has been somewhat of a struggle. The environment in Washington is often an environment that's hostile to change. I'm sure we all know that, don't we? Well, if you think it's so at the federal level, you have never seen what it's like at the city government level. We have more trolls. I'm sorry. Is there a nice word for troll? Checker?
Yeah, but you don't want to use that either.
Okay. People who are reveling in the history of schools long past. It is just wonderful, the people you hear who will tell you the school system was fine up until 1 or 2 superintendents ago. And literally, when I left Stanford and moved to Washington, D.C. in 1973, they were throwing a superintendent out as I was coming in, those who remember Dr. Barbara Sizemore, and they said she was really too reformist. She wanted too much change, and they were throwing her out of the door. Since that time, I know we've had 10 or 15, and the people who've been thrown out the fastest are typically the people who come in the door and actually try to make some level of change or would like to make some level of change. But here we are, that they are reveling in this, and so everything is just wonderful the way it was. Well, let me tell you about the way it was. We live in a city where it's often reported that 60% of the students graduate. That's really about 49%. That's the real truth. We live in a city where there are more men from the city in prison than there are children in high school, boys or girls. We live in a city where fewer than 20% of the kids go to college. And of those, probably only 15 to 20% of them finish within the 4-year period. We live in a city where the majority of the people who work in the city live elsewhere, where fewer than 27 to 30% of the population actually have jobs in the city. And one would think that based on those circumstances, that change in public education would be something everyone would be screaming for. No. What would make you think that? But this is the type of environment that we found at Friendship Schools. This is the type of environment that we live. What have we done since that time? If you were to think about it and say that Friendship was in the first wave of charter schools, we now have charter schools on about 75 to 80 campuses. Some of them are multi-campus charter schools. But what we do know is about 77% of the children in charter schools are making gains. Think about what I'm saying. About 77% are making gains. Not all of the gains are what you would call significant, but they are statistically significant when you think that the population, the school-age population of the city, is getting poorer. And when you think that a larger and larger percentage of those poor kids are attending charter schools. I opened 2 schools that had, at one point, a 90-some% population of free and reduced lunch. And if you can think about the magnitude of that, and not the learning problems that might come with it. What I want you to think are the social problems that might come with it, that you also have to somehow incorporate solutions for within the schools that you are attempting to provide. And so that was an enormous chore. But what we became was not just a school, but we became a school system that had connected with it immense social services components that allowed our children to succeed. What happened over the years? We started off with a bang. Within 2 to 3 years that our schools were open, both of our schools were among the top gainers in terms of Stanford 9 test scores in the District of Columbia. Everyone was saying that the work was outstanding. People did give us a lot of attention on it, but what was also taking place at the same time was that first wave of teachers, the true believers, were beginning to also make the turnovers. And so you begin to get the people who come in on the second rung or second round. And what happens there? They don't quite have that fervor. And so you then have to begin to do what other school systems should be doing. You have to engage in significant professional development. You have to engage in model programs that allow teachers to experiment. You have to work very, very hard to keep your parents actively involved in the lives of their children. All of this in an atmosphere of flux, because the population of Washington is rapidly changing. The city is rapidly gentrifying. The most popular thing in Washington is the $500,000 one-bedroom condo overlooking a pit, and it just happens because we have so many new law students who come in, and now they're well, it's true, Checker. Now the thing is, you give them a $150,000 bonus and a BMW convertible to sign on with you, so they can immediately buy, one of the new one-bedroom condos. But with that happening, the school population itself is in a state of flux, and so you have so many parents and children moving out of town. Essentially, Washington has become a city of the upper middle class and rich and poor. And so the middle class have moved to the surrounding counties, and they really moved for better housing, as well as a number of them thought that they were moving to better school systems. It was unfortunate if they moved to Prince George's County, because they were not, but if you moved to Montgomery, Fairfax, or Arlington County, you really were moving to where education is valued and supported. And so that, I think, was quite a positive force as a parent, if you could afford to leave town. But within that context, charter schools began to grow and grow and grow. The school system lost more than 22,000 of its students during this period. With that growth came the resistance factor. Laws, rules, regulations, audits. People talk about the freedom that you have as a charter school. My schools are audited 55 separate times each year. I have people on my staff who have no other function than to prepare for the next audit. So if you think we're independently, smoothly running, happy-go-lucky, we can't even spend the money we have without getting prior permission if it's over $25,000. Someone has to approve it at the Public Charter School Board, and they have, quote unquote, 90 days to approve it. good. We hope it's not food, right? But these are some of the things that we face. We are, I think, fairly successful as a charter school. I'm most proud of the work that we've done in trying to build a successful high school. When we started off on that venture, those of us who are in this business, you know, you're often the little middle class boy or girl, and you're off doing your good thing, and so the first rung of students that I got in the high school, many of them came with ankle bracelets, and I of course had absolutely not a clue what was going on, and I think I was probably one of many. And so we really had to build something there. We've worked hard over the 8 years that the high school has been open. We operate the largest Gates early college high school program in the United States. Not just that, we have grown to be the largest high school in Washington, D.C. We've outpaced Woodrow Wilson High School, which was for years the largest, but we are the largest. We graduated this past year 287 kids. 287 kids were accepted into college. 90% of the kids who were in that graduating class began with us in the 9th grade. And so we provide a stable environment, a fairly high achieving environment. We have 12 Posse scholars at our school, more than any school in the United States of America. And if you could think about what that's like for a school that's located in Ward 7 in Washington, D.C., where some of my kids come as much as an hour away on subway and bus to get to our campus. They're telling me to get out. Then you know what it's like and how proud you can be of what you have accomplished. And we look forward to taking on more challenges toward getting our kids into more highly selective colleges and universities, and we're starting to see that happen also. But we have to take a lot of pains to open the world up to them because they really don't know it's out there. We have kids leaving today on the way to China. We have kids on the way to South America and Central America, and they didn't have to sell one cookie to get there. It all came out of the same per pupil that they're running D.C. public school system on. But there's a lot going on with charters. It's not going to all take place in 2 years or 3 years. But our parents need choice. Our parents need opportunities. Our children need choice. Our children need opportunities. But we have got to stick together and fight for this. We can't be flaky in our support. Thank you.
You know, I went to a groundbreaking for Donald's latest school a couple of months ago. It was a day after I'd come out of a state that will remain nameless, where legislators were bickering over whether or not they would allow school boards or another authorizer to approve charter schools. And I sat there for an hour and a half and listened to Reverend Butts just compare his school to the dream that King had. And I watched these students entertain and talk, and I watched these teachers in tears as this was happening. And I thought, these legislators sometimes, with all due respect to those of you in the room, because I know there's a lot of great ones out there, sometimes just don't have a clue. And if you ever get in that position where you're faced with one, or if you're a legislator that sometimes maybe thinks you don't have a clue, come visit Donald's School or anything like it. Jim Goenner sponsors schools like Donald Hense at Central Michigan University. Jim, tell us how it happens.
Thanks, Jeanne, and I guess I'll make a standing offer. Donald, when you're ready to open in Michigan, we'd love an application. We'll put it on the fast track. Charter school authorizers. As the Fordham Foundation and as Checker wrote is really one of the new parts of the education landscape, that early in the years we focused on charter schools, the schools like Donald runs, and that later along the way we came to say, what are these things called authorizers? And that truly they are part of a new creation of the educational landscape. So I want to start by talking a little bit about what a charter school authorizer is and what they can be and what they're supposed to do. Across the country, there's really two major goals for charter schools right now. And that's charter schools, the idea. The idea is, how do you grow more choice, more change, more competition? And so quality charter school authorizers you can think about in three key ways. Are they market makers? Are they change agents? And are they forces for quality? And an authorizer is in a unique spot to play those. Let me explain. A market maker is one that helps charter quality schools, that helps create a market where we can have schools that are unfettered from the rules and regulations in exchange for the accountability. At Central Michigan University, we've chartered 58 schools across the state that serve 30,000 students. And as Donald said, it's not easy. Here's our story. Not only have we been audited by the Office of the Auditor General, we've had school districts, one famous that wrote our president and said, Mr. President, because Central Michigan University is chartering schools, we will no longer take your student teachers. We will no longer hire your graduates. And we will no longer recommend our high school students attend your university. Now that was what we called the shot heard around the world. Front page of the paper, and he became former superintendent in a hurry. Because as the fourth largest university in the state of Michigan, we could not afford to be blackmailed because we were doing what we thought's right, chartering public schools that operated as public schools that had been through a constitutional challenge and determined by our Michigan Supreme Court that they were constitutional in serving public school students. In fact, our legislatures upped the ante and said any school district that takes that type of activity against an authorizing body may lose their state school aid funding. It got their attention. So that's the market maker. The second part is the change agent. We are changing the system, and the system is not going to change without some push. And so we are, if you will, that external stimulus. And I like to look at it in track from nation at risk, because Michigan last year adopted new graduation standards, very tough standards. And I went back and I looked at a nation at risk and what they recommended. It only took us 20 years to get there. It's almost verbatim the same. And so setting the standards, being that change agent, is tough work. But it's happening. And we need to judge it not only on the schools that are being created and the students they're serving, but also on the secondary effects. And if I had $1 for every superintendent over the years that's whispered to me something like this, Jim, I can't say it publicly, but when you chartered that school or you talked about chartering that school, it gave me the leverage I needed to make change in my own district. We think that's a very, very powerful thing. So the third part then is the force for quality. And indeed, we believe that we are a force for quality, not only with the schools we charter, but we also have played a role at the national level and at our own state level on setting standards for what we call performance contracting. And that's truly how we think of charters. Can we issue a performance contract for a new type of public school that will serve kids and provide measurable outcomes? And we've had some success at that. I also have the good fortune of chairing the National Association of Charter School Authorizers Board. And we've developed principles and standards that states can look to. And they can also then be customized to your own individual states through your own laws and regulations. But the key to all of it is the outcomes. At the end of the day, what do we want to have happen? And we boil it down to two things. Number one, are the kids learning? Seems pretty basic. And number two, are the dollars being taken care of? And yes, there's a lot of things that go in between that, but those are the two key things. And so as Jeanne mentioned, once in a while we get to school closures. And about 5 years ago, we pulled a group of what we called focus groups. We wanted to see what parents and community members were thinking when we were preaching the Get Tough message. And that was simply, if you don't perform, you're out of business. We'll close you down. And across the urban, suburban, and rural demographics, parents, to absolutely each one of them, said to us, that's a red flag. And we stepped back and said, whoa, that's a red flag? We thought we were preaching the right thing. And they said to us, if the school's not performing, don't put my baby on the street. Change management. Change management. And we thought, well, that makes a lot of sense from a parent's perspective. And so how can we keep true to the charter principles that you perform or you get out, and at the same time not put babies on the street? So we started thinking about closure differently. Closure, when you close a school, is like dropping the nuclear warhead. You put kids on the street, parents on the street, teachers on the street, financial investors in bonds for buildings on the street. You move a lot of people out. And yes, there's times that we've had to do that. In fact, I ended up on Nightline one time for closing a charter school. And so it's not the most fun thing. But the reality is we found out that we could do surgical strikes. And that if we had a board member, or we had an administrator, we had a business manager, we had somebody that was embezzling money, not doing what's right for kids, that we could come in a proactive way and do a surgical strike, eliminate the problem, and keep the school open for the kids. And we've had some great success at that. And we think, again, that's part of the force for quality, in the sense that as a country, as states, we know what schools are working, and we have a pretty darn good idea which ones aren't. The question is what to do about it. And so we've taken it on ourselves to say, well, we've got schools that aren't working. We chartered them. What can we do about it? And we've put them into what we call a special operations unit. And the special operations unit is just that. I like to call them our mercenaries. But they go in and they understand, they observe, and they discuss. And at the end of the day, their goal is to get that school coming out of the special operations unit like a finely tuned Cadillac, maybe a Lexus for some of those that would prefer that brand, or to pull the plug and put them down, get them out. And we've had some great success. In fact, one school got the School of the Year award that's given out by Michigan's Charter School Association last year after 5 years of a turnaround operation. And yes, indeed, we've closed schools as well. It's not our proudest day at work, but it needs to be done. And so at the end of the day, what's it take to be a good authorizer? I like to say it takes two things, the will and the capacity. And the will's very simple. It costs nothing. It's what we call political guts. The capacity is different. It certainly does take money. It takes talent. It takes resources. It takes systems. It takes tools. And as authorizers, we're learning to build those. But the key lesson across authorizers around the country essentially comes down to, are you committed and do you have the capacity? The majority of authorizers across this country are local school districts chartering one or two. Oftentimes they're hostile to the idea. They don't make great authorizers. Surprise, surprise. You have to want to do this work, and yet at the same time you have to want the schools to succeed. And so what we like to do is say, as an authorizer, you need to inform and educate before you oversee and enforce. And the enforcement in public education is one that not many people want a part of. It's easy to talk about accountability. It's easy to talk about the standards. It's easy to talk about getting tough. And it's great to advocate for closing schools. But until you've looked the little girl in the eye who asked me, Mr. Goenner, why are you taking my school away from me? You've looked her in the eye, you've answered the nasty phone calls, you've had the senators and the representatives, sometimes governors, bond houses, investors say, why are you closing the school? You know how much money we're going to lose? And your board says, you know what? The school's not performing for these kids. Somebody else is standing in the wings ready to go. We're going to do this because it's the right thing. That's when you know your system works. It's the ultimate test, we call it. And it's the test that you never want to get to, but it's the test that eventually will come your way. Because as authorizers, we're not as smart as the famed story about Fred Smith. And you know that he wrote the term paper about Federal Express. And the professor gave him, I think, a C as the story goes, and said part of the assignment was it had to be able to be operationalized. And while this is a great idea, it could never work. Well, that's our challenge as authorizers. We get applications. I like to call them dreams on paper. And we have to decide which can work and which can't work. And while we try and blend the art and the science, as Jeanne likes to refer to it as, we're not that smart. We probably will reject a school that's like Fred Smith's term paper and could be operationalized and could be great. And that's why there needs to be multiple authorizers. There needs to be competition in that sphere as well. So with that, I will turn it back, and we'll have some good questions as we go on. Thank you.
So as Checker's getting up to tell us everything we haven't heard so far and what you really need to know everything about charter schools, let me just also offer that an authorizer, as Jim just talked about, as he represents, think about it, it's actually just a brand new kind of way of doing business in public education. And it starts at any level. It can start at university, a mayor level, but the bottom line is you don't need to be elected to a school board to know how to actually authorize and run great schools. Checker, tell us what we need to know.
Thank you very much. First, I need Francisca to come up here and get me to my first slide, which you probably won't be able to see anyway. Part of this grandfather thing is not being very technologically proficient, though my kids are, and my 4-year-old there we are. Now make it full screen. Good job. Yeah. Don't look at the slide yet. Let me talk for a couple minutes, and then I'll try to go through a few slides that may or may not prove illuminating. Let me first say, Donald, if you're ready to come to Ohio, we'll give you a priority pass to open a charter school or 2 or 3 there. He runs the biggest and best charter schools in the District of Columbia. Jim is, by most accounts, the best authorizer in the country. So you're hearing the good about charter schools from them and expertise and seeing what the charter opportunity creates. The charter movement has come a long way since 1991 with the 4,400 schools and the 1.4 million kids and so forth and the 41 states. It's a mixed bag when it turns into examining its performance and its success rate to date. The organizers of the conference asked if I'd like to try to review what we know from research about charter schools. So I revisited some of the research, and I'm going to show you a few things, but it's genuinely confusing. So let me tell you the 3 conclusions that I've come to about what we've learned from research into charter schools. First, putting a charter sign over the door of a school is an opportunity to create a school that is different and better, but it is not a guarantee that the school will be different or better. In fact, putting the charter sign over the school door tells you very little about the school. In fact, generalizing about charter schools turns out to be almost as hard as generalizing about district schools or generalizing about private schools. They are so different from each other. Some of the best schools in the country are charter schools, and some of the worst schools in the country are charter schools. Second conclusion. The academic performance of charter schools today is truly mixed. Truly mixed. As I said, some of the best schools, some of the worst schools. Third conclusion, maybe the most discouraging for those of us who spend at least part of our lives in think tanks, the research in this field is chaotic. Chaotic, uneven, and contradictory. I spend part of my time in the world of think tanks. I spend part of my time on the ground in Ohio, where we, in fact, my foundation, the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation, is in fact one of those multiple authorizers that Jim was just recommending. So part of my life is feet on the ground, feet getting dirty. In the real world, part of my life is sitting in a think tank in Washington. You know, somebody once joked that a think tank is a place where reality is examined to see if it accords with theory. There's a lot of truth to that, but I've also discovered that reality is a place where theory is subjected to testing, and it doesn't always work as well as it seemed like it might back in the think tank. Okay, let's look at a little bit of the research in this field to date. I hope you can see some of it. The first slide is the notorious 2003 national assessment-based study of charter school achievement. That is based on 2003 NAEP results, first reported by the American Federation of Teachers, and first reported in hostile fashion by the American Federation of Teachers. What you can see up on the slightly confusing screen is that there were in this sample a total of 148 charter schools, which is not very many of them, that 70 of those were affiliated with districts, that 78 of them were independent of districts, that is non-district charter schools, and then of course they were compared in this same sample with 6,754 district schools, the regular district-operated public schools. This is NAEP fourth grade reading on the NAEP scale of basically 0 to 500. If you look at the generalization, for charter schools, all schools, average reading performance 212. If you look across at district non-charter schools, average reading performance of 217. That's fundamentally the comparison of numbers that led to the conclusion that charter schools are failing, or the allegation that charter schools are failing in that the district schools were doing better. Even here, however, if you begin to just dig a little bit deeper, you see that it's more complicated than that. Go down to the row that says Central City Location Serving High Minority Population. There we discover that the charter schools are at 197. If you look all the way across, the 1,039 district schools are at 197. It's an equivalent score for inner city minority schools. Based on what is here a very small sample of charter schools taken in snapshot fashion. There's nothing resembling a growth score here. There's nothing resembling a gain score here. There is nothing resembling value added or change over time. Just a flat snapshot. Fundamentally, Central City charter schools equivalent to Central City district schools. Okay, that was the notorious NAEP report, and as released by the AFT. Next slide. The Fordham Foundation, as I said, is an authorizer of charter schools in Ohio, in Dayton, Springfield, Cincinnati, and this coming fall in Columbus, where I'm pleased to say, incidentally, we'll have Ohio's first KIPP school up and operating in Columbus. This particular chart looks at the 8 schools that the Fordham Foundation sponsored in 2006-07 on the Ohio state reading tests and compares them with the state charter average. Okay? You'll see one of the schools we sponsored did better than the state charter average. It's the Phoenix School in Cincinnati. And 7 did as bad or worse or equivalent to the state charter school average. That's one way to look at this. And no, I'm not going to stand up here and say that the schools we sponsor are obvious titanic success stories academically. But that's what you get from this slide. Now let's look at them a different way, however. Now we're comparing the charter schools, the same charter schools, with the average score of the kids in their district, the home district of these charter schools. Same test, state reading test, home district comparison. Guess what? It looks like most of the Fordham schools did better than their home district in reading on the same test in the same year. So am I giving you, and 2 did worse. Am I giving you good news? Am I giving you bad news? Well, I'm giving you news. I'm giving you complexity. I'm giving you some of the difficulty with these appraisals. Here are the state's ratings of those same schools on Ohio's rating system, which ranges from academic emergency to excellent over 2 years, the 05-06 year, the 06-07 year. The arrows show which direction they were going. So if you look, for example, at the Dayton Academy, one of the Edison schools that we are sponsored for, and I see John Chubb just walked into the room. Welcome, John. That particular school went from continuous improvement, which is equivalent to a C, in 05-06 to academic watch, which is equivalent to a D in the state rating system in 06-07. If you go down, however, to the Omega School, a little independent charter school in Dayton, it went up from academic emergency to academic watch. And the Springfield Academy went from academic emergency, which is like an F, to continuous improvement, which is like a C. Mixed bag, jumping all over the lot on the state's rating system between 2 years. Fordham has its own set of goals for the schools it sponsors. These are written into our contracts with the schools and then part of our annual report on how the schools are doing. And this is how the schools did on our various criteria in 06-07. The most important one, I think, in the NCLB area is the top line, which says, did the school make adequate yearly progress, or AYP? In the NCLB era, like it or not, that is the coin of the realm, and you will see that we just put letters on the schools here rather than names to make the chart slightly less confusing. Only 3 of the schools made AYP that year. We have schools that did well in math. We have schools that did well in reading. We don't have any schools that averaged 5% growth on the reading portion of the state test. We had 1 school that averaged 5% growth on the math portion of the state test, etc. Very mixed bag. You can look at this many different ways. That was Fordham in Ohio. Now let's look at the Chicago Charter School Foundation, one of the biggest charter operators in the country, where Caroline Hawksby, one of the country's foremost education economists, did a really careful study. And thanks to the lottery that the schools operate, she was able to compare the ITBS scores, Iowa Test of Basic Skills scores, of kids in those charter schools in Chicago with kids who wanted to go to those charter schools in Chicago but couldn't get in. So this is an actual random assignment comparison of kids in charter schools and not in charter schools in this particular set, and she is showing statistically significant gains of the CCSF kids over 4 years. That's the Chicago Charter School Foundation schools versus the kids who didn't get into those schools. This is pretty good news on a statistically matched look in some long-standing and pretty well operating charter schools in Chicago. Now let me take you to a generalized review of sort of all the available studies of charter schools that Brian Hassel did a year and a half ago for the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. He basically got his hands on every study that had been done of charter schools, and he found across the collection of studies, 25 of them were just snapshot studies, like the NAEP study that looked at results at a point in time. 16 were what the social scientists call panel studies, following individual students over time, and 17 were other kinds of change studies, looking at, for example, changes in school averages over time. So the 33, the 16 and the 17, those 33 represent what most social scientists would regard as decent studies, as opposed to snapshot studies. If you're interested in whether the school's doing any good, you don't just take a snapshot of the kids in it. So, this is another way of saying the same thing. 33 of the 50 studies attempted to look at change over time in student or school performance. 16 of them followed students over time. 17 of them examined growth by looking at changes in school-wide or grade-wide scores. These are the high-quality studies based on Brian's analysis. What do the high-quality 33 studies show? All right, and I will finish with these. First, 16 of the studies find overall gains larger in charter schools than in the comparison or district schools. 7 studies find charter gains greater than district schools for certain subsets of charter schools, not for all the charter schools in the study, for elementary schools, for example, rather than high schools. Or for independently operated charter schools rather than EMO schools. I'm making those up, but those are examples of different categories within the charter school world. 6 studies find essentially equivalent gains, charter schools versus district schools. And 4 studies find charter gains lower than those in the district schools with which they were being compared. What you're going to conclude from this, there are 2 conclusions I think you can fairly draw from this. The good studies, for the most part, found charter schools doing better in gains for students than the equivalent district schools. Second conclusion, the research is chaotic, and you can find any study you want to illustrate any conclusion you would like to illustrate. about charter schools in America today. On that somewhat sobering note, I think it's time for discussion. Thank you very much.
That was great, Checker. Thank you. And I would love to engage the discussion right now. And I actually want to turn to our panelists to start off and then kick it off to the audience. So, Donald, mixed bag. What does it mean? Does it matter? And does anything Checker just said really matter?
Usually not.
I mean, really, in the scheme of things.
Fortunately or unfortunately, the people who are interpreting the various studies that Checker has recognized today are typically the individuals who are in legislative positions, who are looking for opportunities to hinder the growth or stifle the growth of charter schools. And I think that that's one of the problems that comes out of the vast amount of research that we have on charters. It is confusing, and it does take experts to understand that. But with that being the case, I believe that the measure of schools really has to do with where the kids are going. And if your kids are graduating and they're stable and they're moving off to college, then I really think that that is a top-notch measurement. But of course, my opinion doesn't count.
So, Checker, does that mean that we need 4,200 individual sets of tests to be analyzed on a regular basis? And really, is there anything such as an objective researcher? I mean, think about all the things we went through with that 2003 NAEP scores and who said what.
Is there an objective researcher? This is like the old joke about, would someone please find me a one-handed economist? To avoid the on the one hand, on the other hand phenomenon. I think we're going to be living with chaotic research for some time to come, honest to God. I think that if there's anything good about NCLB, it's the fact that it is shedding a lot of sunlight on public schools, including charter schools all over the country, in terms of their academic performance, and more states and outside analysts are moving toward value-added or growth-type analyses, which are the high-quality kind, by which you can get some sense of whether the school is adding value to the kids. So I think we're going to see more of those kinds of studies, mostly at the state level, because until and unless we have a national test, we're going to be looking at each state's performance on its own test, on its own standards, and I think that's a whole other topic, of course. But I think we're going to be seeing more evidence, but I think we're going to be getting more good studies, meaning the kind you can take some satisfaction that they might be telling you the truth about whether the school's effective or not.
And Jim, help us answer that too and address this as well. Standing in Texas once, bill going through the legislature, we're going to reward 25% more money is going to go to charter schools that do better on the Texas state test. And the guy looks at me who's running the dropout prevention program, serving 4,500 low-income, mostly Latino students, and says, so in other words, I'm not going to get more money even though I'm keeping kids off the street. What do you do about that in the research conundrum?
It's an issue. Let me try and address it this way by asking the audience a test question. How many of you think marriage is a great idea? Do you ever see anybody implement it poorly? Serious question. Do you ever see anybody implement the great idea of marriage poorly? Okay? That's what you need to understand. Charter schooling is an idea. It's an idea to bring choice and change and competition into public education to make it better, to transform it. There are people that are going to implement the idea poorly. And then there's all different sorts of versions of what people call marriage today. And as Checker said, you cannot generalize with charter schools because people are taking the idea and they're implementing all sorts of different versions of types of schools, learning philosophy, curriculum, approaches. So if you understand that, you're going to be smarter than most of the country when you leave the summit. And you got to spread that because it's a frame in order to understand what's going on. The other key part to the question is that to understand, charter schools are meant to be duly accountable. And so often what the studies don't take into account is the first part of the dual accountability, which is parents vote with their feet to send their children there. They're accountable to the market. So if you believe in that part of accountability, it's absolutely critical, because then the second part is they're accountable to a governmental agency. That's where the test scores come in. So mixed bag, yeah, but parents don't pick schools based on the things researchers look at in studies. They pick on what's best for my child. And so when they have the ability to choose, it's a very powerful indicator.
Okay, let's open it up. Francisco has a microphone. Gentleman on the right. Please state your name, who you are, why you're asking your question, and who you're asking.
Mark Gotts, Educational Facility Solutions to Chester. Just clarify for me, because in my understanding, basically you get a bunch of data up there about matching charter schools versus the public school systems in different areas. It's my understanding that, first of all, charter schools don't necessarily get a lot of students from magnet schools and high-end affluent areas. Predominantly, I would say probably 80% of charter schools are, and you should know the numbers better than me, are servicing lower minority income students. So if that be the case, number one, you're not getting an apples to apples relationship. Number two, if you have the information about the child from when they started school in kindergarten and can trace it, then you can truly see true gains. And number three, a charter school that's 1 or 2 years old, unless they have a magic wand, how can they take what has already been produced from the public school system unsuccessfully and remediate it in that period of time?
Those are all among the challenges of doing charter school research and of looking at the data in a fair and revealing way. So many of the schools are very new. Some of them take kids who've already been damaged by other schools. The only thing which I would push back a little bit on is the apples-to-apples comparison. If you're looking at home district scores in places like Dayton and Cleveland and Cincinnati, you're not looking at any rich kids. There aren't any left in the public schools of those cities. That's another story, and a sad one. But you're looking at poor and minority kids in the district comparisons as well. Arguably, the charter kids are marginally more fortunate because their parents cared enough to move them.
Hi, I'm Daniel Woodring, and I used to be General Counsel of the Department of Education here in Florida. Question for you. You said that these studies are kind of chaotic and all over the place. If we're assuming, though, that, let's say, the studies are accurate, then much of the data you're showing shows that it's not necessarily charter schools you're looking at, because charter schools run the gamut. As you said, marriages that are well implemented and are poorly implemented. Is there anything that the panel can say as to what is it within a subset of charter schools? What are the subset of charter schools that are doing a great job, doing it consistently, and are there any things in common that can be identified out of the overall charter school group?
Let me just ask, if you answer the question, give an example so we can actually put a face to a name.
Donald schools are doing a great job. In my experience, the answer to your question is it takes you back to a considerable extent to the so-called effective schools research of the 1970s. The things that make charter schools highly successful turn out to be remarkably similar to the things that make district schools and private schools remarkably successful. They have a clear mission, they have a coherent curriculum, they have good leadership, they have a committed team all pulling in the same direction, they have a culture of achievement, they have the ability to manage their own affairs, which is sometimes better in a charter situation than in other situations. If you've got those qualities, you're likely to find a good school. Now, some of these are centrally managed in the sense that there's an EMO or a CMO that is doing this for a whole bunch of schools, as opposed to a one-off school or a little network of schools like Donald's. But I don't think there's a clear formula within the charter movement that's all that different from the formula for successful schools in the district and private sectors, though I'd be delighted if Donald or Jim wanted to quarrel with me on this one.
No, not at all. In fact, I'd echo that. But I think here's one of the challenges for public education, which is so often we're out finding the charismatic school leader, and that leader is going to make the difference. And there's no question the school leader, and if they're charismatic, that helps, but it's not sufficient long-term. So we like to look at great schools, kind of the way Jim Collins talks about greatness, sustained superior performance. So we've taken an approach with our schools to look at them holistically, so that the great leader, the great management, the great curriculum, the clear mission, but also is it a sound organization, financially, organizationally, governance, et cetera. Because schools that have systems that can sustain beyond the charismatic leader are the ones that are going to win long-term for kids.
I really believe that what has helped us more than anything is that we began our schools with I think a very solid relationship with a management company. And Edison at the time had huge resources, and Chris Whittle and I became famous friends, and he gave us lots of it. We paid back all of our loans and everything, which was one of the rare times that it happened. But it allowed us to build a very, very strong financial position. Now, I think our budget, yearly budget is just under $80 million a year, and we have in excess of $100 million in assets as an organization. We're no longer in partnership with Edison, but we got that strong foundation. The other thing that happened is that there was a culture, a culture of achievement that was developed within the schools, and I think that is hugely important. But I would like to caution against people who are continually looking for the 2-year miracle. I mean, to be very honest with you right now, we are getting kids in our schools who come into kindergarten and have never been in a home with books. They cannot identify either a letter or a number. And we've got to stop believing that this is unusual. It is not unusual. And so to expect that you're suddenly going, or any school is suddenly going to make such huge gains with this kid is absolutely ridiculous. And I think we need to dissuade ourselves of that particular notion.
And I want to make a comment on that and then also throw a question back to the panel about that. Going back to what I said earlier in my introduction about it being a model structure, the notion that connects everything you've heard is that the chartering concept allows you to do things. It doesn't guarantee you, as Checker said, but it came about and still remains critical in most states, I'll save the final 10, because the concept is you can, in fact, create a new culture. You can introduce a new curriculum. You can rebuild a school. You can hire in a different way that you cannot in a traditional school district that's been doing the same way over and over again. My question to tee back to the panel about the research, if we agree that it's a mixed bag, if we know the data is uneven upon which the studies are based, regardless of what we know, how come even so-called pro-charter researchers continue to say, oh, the data shows EMOs, CMOs, regular charter schools aren't doing better or worse? Why don't they all just say, we know it's a mixed bag and therefore this is the next way to judge? Why do we say it's bad and then we use it?
I would like to say something.
Please.
Just on that point, it is going to take someone of Checker's stature to get together with 2 or 3 other people of his stature and say this is it. And I truly believe that the time is ripe for that, and we certainly have one of those persons on this panel. I believe that.
Checker's going to give me an opportunity, and then he'll have the final word. I don't think it'll happen, and I bring just political, practical view to this. Too many people make money off of getting research grants from philanthropic organizations and governments to take pros and cons and to do studies. So it's an industry, and industries like to generate money. I think the other part of it is that if you just assumed, let's say charter schools are worse, right? So that's the setup of all of these. Are they better than what? Better than districts. Let's just say they came out conclusively they're worse. Would you say the idea that parents can pick the school for their kid is a bad idea? Would you conclude that parents should be able to choose a school rather than be assigned to it by government? So the idea that choice is good in and of itself is a core principle that I think people need to back up and think about from a very practical standpoint. And then part of this idea is not just about schools. It's inevitable once you get into this, you understand that the regulatory system, the apparatus, the testing and measurement system is clearly absolutely inadequate. My kids know more about a baseball player from their card than we know about kids in schools. It is absolutely amazing when you truly get into the data. So my last point is this. How many of you have had to fire somebody? Firing a person is tough work. What do you got to have? Data, right? And then you got to tell them about it. You got to give them a chance to improve. Then you say, hey, you haven't improved. Maybe you give them a second, third chance, then you pull the trigger. Now think about firing a school of 500 kids, 1,000 kids, 2,000 kids. You better have the data. And I'm here to tell you, having looked at data multiple ways, when you get into a high-stakes decision like firing a person or firing a school, you better have your case. And the data and the testing and the measurement is inadequate in this country right now.
There's a lot of value in the things that parents are looking for when they pick schools, and we shouldn't be putting it down at all, and nobody up here is. When they're looking for safety, for decent people, for a welcoming environment, for a convenient location, for teachers that care about their kids, these are important values, and they are part of what you get with school choice and with charters within the larger world of school choice. What's the real growth era, the real growth industry in the NCLB era actually has nothing to do with charters. It has to do with the growth industry of attempting to evaluate school performance in America. Individual schools, subgroups of kids within schools, schools versus schools, schools within districts, states, country versus other countries. The effort to evaluate school performance and school system performance is going to continue growing. It is not going away. It is a growth industry partly because the government has made it one, and partly because the funders have made it one, and partly because the researchers have made it one, and partly because there is something to be said for what's called data-driven schools or data-based schools. And the more a school knows about its own performance, the greater the likelihood that it's going to have a better performance next week or next month or next year. So it would be a big mistake to come out of this session saying, poo on research, let it all go to hell. It isn't going to hell. It's going to continue to proliferate. On the whole, the country is better off for it and is going to continue to be better off for it the more we learn about our school's performance. The painful wrinkle in the charter world is that those keenest to use the research findings are those with a political agenda of putting an end to charter schools. That is a fact, but the research isn't going away, and we'll all be better served if more and better research is done going forward.
And just so I don't come across as anti-research, one of the things we do as an organization is completely data-driven. We've built an electronic system to drive data, drive compliance. We're driving test scores. We triangulate them from a value-added assessment model to a growth model to a criterion referenced model. And so I think that's the key, though, is to get this down to a smaller unit level, to the child, to the classroom teacher, to the school, to the district. And when you can look at data on that spread of level, that unit of analysis, now you've got something that actually people can make decisions with.
Okay, back to the audience.
Good morning, Alex Penn-Williams with the Florida Department of Education. You know, Mark Twain once said that there are lies, damn lies, and then there are statistics, but that said, it's really all we've got, and I'm a real firm believer in responsible research. My question to Chester is, of the 33 studies that you talked about, how many of those were in fact experimental models which with the match sample that you can only really do with the lottery charter schools? How many of them were there? And do you know what the results of those were?
No, I don't. We could ask Brian. I'm not going to fake it. The only study up on the screen that I'm certain was an experimental model was Hawksby's. Look at those schools in Chicago. I simply don't know. A lot of states don't have data systems like Florida's. Florida deserves accolades for its state data system.
Thank you.
And in a lot of places, it would be really hard to carry out that study with the kids who didn't go to the charter school because you wouldn't know where they were.
One thing that we've done across the 30,000 students is we track them by year enrolled, and we can show basically a stair step from 1 year, 2, 3, 4, 5, but the biggest gains are becoming between year 4 and 5.
And here's the other complicating factor, which many of the people up here have talked about, many of the people in the audience can allude to, including our friend John Chubb. You also have schools that you're comparing. Now, granted, district schools can say this too, but it's more typical that district schools are going to be roughly in the same ballpark of size. They're going to be roughly the same makeup over time. We've had your middle schools, your junior high schools, you can look at the same structures. When we look at the data the Center for Education Reform has been collecting since the inception of the movement, it is phenomenal. We can break it down to elementary, middle, high school. Then you start breaking it down into pre-K through 2. Some schools start at 3rd grade and go through 11th. And then they're going to add a grade the next year. Some start in 10th grade and move backwards. I mean, the arrangement of different configurations of schools, and then you juxtapose those against size. Oh, and then you put them on a corner in Philadelphia, and then you say we're going to compare the school that just started in 10th grade and is working backwards to the traditional public school down the street in 9th through 12th grade. Okay, now unless you do have the resources and the objectivity of a Caroline Hawksby who puts a number on every child and literally follows them for the same test throughout the system, that's the data conundrum, we call it. And it's not the data isn't important, doesn't matter, and yes, data does drive information, particularly as Alex just said, in places like Florida, it's critical, but we have to demand better data at the same time. Don't let people say to you, until we have the data, we can't do anything, because you can keep doing it and perfect it as you go.
You know, the discussion today also has talked about primarily testing data, academic data. We're down to the data on how much your audit costs. And why is a school at the same size paying $11,000 for an audit and you're paying $5,000? What can you learn from that? How much are you paying for your facilities? We've got a tremendous range in the cost of facilities between owned, leased, per square foot, per pupil, and per total expenditures. We're triangulating the data on that degree and feeding it back to the school boards and school management so they can make better decisions.
I think there's a question to your right, Francisco.
Question?
You know, it's extremely difficult to sit through a session like this because you go from question and then somebody answers it, which makes you have another question. And so I guess my point is that as I sit and I squirm in my seat, one of the things, having run a very small charter school, which I feel was extremely successful in operating and doing everything under the sun that larger management companies do, is that you are in a little rowboat in a big ocean that's just waiting for a huge storm to knock you out, and for someone to take your data and use it against a whole movement and say these are why schools or charter schools fail. When you look at what it takes to run a smaller school and be innovative and be cutting edge and do everything that you need to do, there are just these little things that could come up that could in fact blow you completely out of the water. And so my point is that when you look at the data, you've got to look at the data in more than just student performance. You've got to look at it from the standpoint of the audit and the cost to a school that is being innovative and that is doing everything that charter schools were created to do. You've got to look at them in their uniqueness and in their ability to be able to provide a solid education for the constituents, and whether or not those parents really matter. Because when people start following laws and rules that don't want you around, they're not concerned about those parents who have voted to go away from them with their feet. Trust me, they're not. So I don't have a question.
I got to say, I'm worried about small charter schools. As we look at them in Ohio, at least, the economics under about 300 kids are almost unsustainable, and the personnel, staffing structures, and board structures, and leadership structures are almost irreplaceable in the sense that there's not a continuity or succession plan kind of built in. They're terribly fragile in many cases and awfully dependent upon somebody. And if the somebody gets ill or moves out of town, or in the case of one of our charter schools in Cincinnati, gets indicted, it's what looked like an awfully good school can look bad awfully fast.
I would add, I'm worried about them from a different perspective. I'm worried that we can't help make them survive on that level because they actually are the backbone of so many communities. And I worry that the effort towards scalability, it has to be a big one, it has to be a big box store, is going to drive us to a system that we have today, where you have to have a centralized management, and we all regard, we need all of them. We need small mom and pops, and we need to stop calling them mom and pops, just like I did. We need scalable. We need those that are in concert with nonprofit art institutions and with for-profit companies. We need those all, and I worry that I think our on-the-ground ability to translate into action those kinds of models is directly dependent on people's support. And when we live in a country where basically only 20% of people can name what a charter school is and how it operates, that presents your challenge, which translates to politicians who can't do it, which translates back to the one bad story that ends up messing up your entire school. And so we've been talking about data and research as if there's actually an honest discussion, an honest intention going on there. But I think what Katrina just introduced was the concept that no matter what you do, if there are those people who are misinterpreting your data or are the Palm Beach Post, you have a real challenge. You have a challenge on your hands to actually try to sustain and grow that individual charter school that everybody's got to consider.
We have time for just 2 more questions, and I also just want to remind everybody the evaluation forms in front of you at the end of the session. If you can hand them to Will, who's standing there in the back. Thanks.
Francisco, this gentleman over here had his hand up first.
Pass it right to him real quick. I only have a quick comment, and that is the good news is the data that I've seen says that only 4% of charter schools fail. Now, understanding charter schools are small businesses, and the rate of failure of small business in this country is 60%. So there is a substantial difference between the small business of charter schools and small business of the rest of the world.
It does depend on the state. It's about 12 nationally. Some states it's higher, some states it's lower. And by the way, the vast majority of those close within the first 3 years due to financial or regulatory reasons, not academic necessarily. That could be good or bad, depending on how you interpret it.
Yeah, this kind of leads into a thought that I was rolling over here. And we got a pretty valuable commodity here, our children. And I hear Mr. Hense say that his oversight and regulations seem to cause a lot of thrashing and wasted motion. And certainly, I'm a public school superintendent, I should have said that. We certainly have a lot of thrashing and wasted motion and auditors and everything. What type of oversight, if you have a good, Mr. James Goenner there, if you have a good pro forma that you approve, what type of oversight would allow it to get better and not tailspin out and get worse?
Very quick story. As I said, our law requires a charter school authorizer to be able to certify to the state that the schools at charters are in compliance with the charter contract and all applicable law. So as newbies, we went to the Michigan Department of Education and we said, can you give us a list of all applicable laws that apply to public schools? Well, they didn't say they couldn't, but it never came. So we put somebody on it that had worked for 3 gubernatorial governors, knew his way around state government. Took him 6 months. He collected 250 forms that apply to public schools. 150 came out of the Michigan Department of Education. The other 100 came out of other areas of state government, tax, agriculture, labor, certification, etc. My point with that is we used to take them around to legislative hearings. They stood that tall, and everybody laughed. But it was not funny. That's what public schools are dealing with. And that's where I think the faster we can move this discussion away from charter schools versus district schools and move it to school performance, the quicker we can build an allegiance with superintendents to go after the regulatory system. And I love state departments of education. I have a lot of friends that work for them and terrific experts in them. But as organizations generally across the 50 states, I think most would argue they're dysfunctional. And what's happening is the schools then are trying to hit that target. And at the end of the day, you got to decide where do you want schools to spend their time and energy, with the kids or with the paper.
Before you join me in thanking the panel, please do fill out this evaluation form so we can all come back here and listen to Mickey next year. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Yes.
Legislative sworn recently, actually.